Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining my session today. 5 tips every admin needs in 2022. Before we get started, a big thank you to the sponsors of the event today, because without them, events like this couldn't happen. A little bit about me before we get started. My name is Christine Marshall. I'm the Courses and Community Director at Salesforce Ben. I'm also a Salesforce MVP. I hold 6 certifications, but I'm studying for about 4 more right now. And I am passionate about helping everyone else become certified and get a job in the Salesforce ecosystem. And as such, I'm currently serving on the EMEA Workforce Development Group, which is done through Salesforce. In my spare time, I love to do even more things Salesforce. I'm the leader of the Bristol Salesforce Admin Group, and I also mentor with Supermums. But that's enough about me. Let's kick it straight off with our first of 5 tips today, which is to build your automations in Flow. And I think this might be the most important tip for this session today. But if you're anything like me, then perhaps you don't love Flow, or you find Flow a lot less intuitive than other automation tools like workflow rules or process builders. But I'm here to be the bearer of bad news. The writing has been on the wall for quite some time. So the retirement of Workflow Rules and Process Builder was announced back in September 2021. We have no choice but to move forward with automation in Flow. But it's not all bad news, because Salesforce are supporting us on that journey. A migration tool for Workflow Rules was released in spring 22. We anticipate a migration tool to be released for Process Builder in spring 23. And if you're like me and you've had a little play around in a pre-release org for winter 23, you will notice that you are no longer able to create workflow rules. That functionality has been switched off, and there's a new little message that says to build your automation in Flow. If you check out any of the help documentation on Salesforce Help or on Trailhead, that will also point you in the direction of Flow for everything pretty much apart from approval processes. The approval process tool is sticking around for now. But what's clear is that the future of automation is Flow, and whether you love it or you love it less, we're all going to have to get good at building our automations in Flow. But this could be a huge task for so many people, so you're going to want to plan your migration carefully. You could have hundreds upon hundreds of workflow rules and process builders. And do you document them anywhere? Do you have a master sheet explaining how all of your automations link together anywhere? And the other thing to be aware of is there is a learning curve with Flow for many people. I think if you come from a development background, then perhaps it feels more intuitive. But if, like me, you are not from an IT background and you don't have an IT degree, Flow feels like a step into the world of developers. There's new terminology and new concepts to get your head around that are really important to learn now before you make any changes, because of course we never want to create legacy technical debt. So we've talked a little bit about the Salesforce migration tool, and that's a fantastic feature that's available to you, but I would offer a word of caution before diving in and using this tool. So the Salesforce migration is a one-to-one. That means 100 workflow rules would create 100 flows, which leads us very nicely onto a question about how many flows should you have per object. And we're going to tackle that in the next slide, but I'll give you a clue, it's not hundreds. So again, be very cautious about using the migration tool, because you don't want to create hundreds and hundreds of flows based on old automations. What you want to be doing is moving your existing workflow rules and process builders into single flows where possible. And this is why I would say that you should consider a rebuild and enhance strategy. And that does mean that you need more resource. It does mean that you'll need the capacity to do so. But you need to start mapping your old automations, thinking about how they link together. Take this as an opportunity to reassess your business processes, to reassess the automation that supports them. Which automations are still needed, which are not needed? If you're lucky, maybe there's some description, maybe the original admin that created them is you or they're still there. But this could be a very tricky process, working out what each automation does, why it does it, is it still needed, is anyone still using it? So again, I would really strongly encourage you to start planning that migration now. Don't wait. Don't wait to start upskilling on flow, and don't wait to start planning that migration. Time is moving along really, really fast. I think we all felt like we had a lot of time when they first announced the retirement, and now suddenly no more new workflow rules are being created from winter 23. The time is coming around really, really quickly. So there are a couple of important flow considerations, and the advice from Salesforce does change occasionally. So currently there's no simple answer to how many flows you should have per object, but there are two main streams of thinking and two options that are considered best practice. So the first one is 3 is the magic number. So for each object, you would have a before create update, an after create update, and a before delete. Now, the issue with the 3 is the magic number option is it will cause performance issues and performance degradation for very, very large complex orgs, which maybe have a lot of data. So for them, we want to think about best practice option 2, and that's multiple smaller flows for various use cases. If they were to try and restrict their flows to just 3 per object, they will experience issues. But instead, what they can do is create multiple flows, but make use of entry conditions to prevent lots of records from being processed. Now, what happens if you don't use entry conditions is that thousands, hundreds of thousands of records can end up being processed, and this will hit limits, which we're going to talk about in a moment, and will cause lots of errors. So again, this needs real planning. But there's a great new feature that can help you with this, and that is the Flow Trigger Explorer. And I've included a screenshot of this for you. So the Flow Trigger Explorer is like a bird's eye view of your flows on an object. And you can see from the top of the picture here, we're looking at when an account record is updated, and you can change that. So you can change the object, so maybe we change account to contact, and you can see we've got record is updated, but we could change that to see what happens when a record is created. So for a particular action on a particular object, in this case, when an account record is updated, what are the flows, what's happening, and in what order are they happening? So if you haven't already, check out the Flow Trigger Explorer. It's going to be really helpful to you as you plan your migration. So a couple more flow best practices for you. And I really wanted to highlight this, and this tip is the biggest tip of this entire session because it's so important and because there's so much that I want to make you aware of. Now, we can't dive into all the detail, and this is not a how-to session on how to do these things, but these are things that I want to make you aware of so that you go away and research them and learn about them before you dive into creating your flows, coming up with your flow strategy, or coming up with your migration strategy. So the first one here is to use subflows. So a subflow is a flow that is called by another flow to execute a set of actions, and these don't count towards that magic number of 3. So use subflows. They're also great for repeatable actions that you might use between different objects or different automations. Now the next one is to use the debug tool. Populate the input variables to test that your flow works as expected. And we're starting to get into a little bit of jargon here, which could be unsettling to anyone not currently using flow. But in essence, the debug tool allows you to populate certain records with the actions that your flow is supposed to take. So you could say, on this opportunity, run my flow. So if your flow was to update a field based on another field, you could test to see if that worked. So you can do that from within the flow, and it's really important that we are testing our flows as we go along and before we deploy anything in production. But the debug tool is very different. We didn't have anything like this for workflow rules or for process builder. So I wanted to make you aware that that is there. And although it sounds a little bit scary with things like input variables, an input variable is simply something like a record ID. You're telling it what record you want to test on. It really is as simple as that. And then finally, add fault paths. So fault paths, again, we didn't have in workflow rules or in process builder, but a fault path provides a fallback path to follow if a statement cannot be executed successfully. Again, this sounds a bit scary and very developer heavy, but it's really not. What it's doing is if you tell the flow to do something and it cannot do it for whatever reason, what should happen? Where should it go? If you don't use fault path, then your users will experience that very familiar error. An unhandled error has occurred and it's got all that jargon underneath and they have no idea what it means. And then you have to do lots of testing to work out what's gone wrong. But with fallback paths, with fault paths, you can tell it where to go next. So let's run through a very quick example. Let's say that when a record meets a certain criteria, you want to email a certain contact. Now, if that contact didn't have an email address, then the flow cannot execute the action. It can't send an email if it doesn't have an email address in the email address field. And in that instant, you would get an error, or your user rather would get an error to say that it cannot execute your requirement. It would get one of those unhandled errors. But instead, we could use a fault path to say, if there isn't an email address, then what should happen next? So very, very powerful functionality, but very different and something to be aware of and to research and learn how to apply it before you start get going with your flows. So why is flow so much harder for us than some of the other tools? Why does it feel perhaps a little less intuitive? And I think it was summed up for me by flow guru Tim Combridge, who writes most of the flow posts on Salesforce Ben, and he also has a flow course if you're looking for something to help you learn flow. I know I personally found it very, very difficult to understand flow concepts until I took Tim's course, and then he used actually this phrase in it, and it was think like a programmatic developer. And for me, that hits the nail on the head as to why I find it so hard and how I need to switch my mindset in order to become very good with flow. So we need to start thinking about things that we've never really had to think of before as admins. SOQL query limits, DML statements, and there's this phrase that we use called bulkify your flows. Lots of terminology, lots of jargon, lots of words that aren't that familiar to us admins. But what you need is someone who can break it down into more accessible terms, or just put it into context that you can appreciate, that makes more sense to you. So I've got two examples for you today that really helped me. Now, off the back of using Tim's course, it's the Ultimate Flow Foundation course on Salesforce Ben. And as I was going through that, we created some graphics together, which I feel really help visually explain some of these flow concepts, and I hope that they'll help you as well. So the first one that you can see on the screen here is talking about DML statements and why you want to use fewer of them and how we end up creating so many of them unintentionally. So let's say that you have a form and you are collecting contact details, and you have a form and you collect contact A, and then you use your flow to say create a contact record. That's one DML statement. And then you collect the data for contact B, and then you say to the flow, create a contact record. That's another DML statement. And let's say we do that 5 times. So we collect the contact details, we create a contact. We collect the next contact details, we create a contact. We've got 5 DML statements in our image here. And you can see how that could escalate very quickly. This is just 5, but what if we've got 200 contacts? What if we've got 2,000 contacts? And that's a lot of heavy processing needed from Salesforce. Now there's this thing that you have with Flow called a collection variable. And this was a concept that I really struggled with. But I like to think of a collection variable as a box or a container, any type of container that you want to imagine. Now, instead of collecting the details and creating a contact, what if I collected the details of all 5 contacts put them in my box, and then use my box to create 5 records. So collect all the details and then create 5 contact records all at once. That's a single DML statement. And that's the sort of thing that we need to be doing and getting into the habit of, using things like collection variables. So collect all the data and then use a single DML statement to create 5 records. Don't do it one by one. And if you want it broken down even more, this is my favorite example of why we would reduce our number of DML statements and use a collection variable. So let's say that you would like to order some new cutlery for your house, and you would like 4 forks, 4 knives, 4 spoons, and you're going to order it off of Amazon. Now, you could order 12 pieces of cutlery, 4 forks, 4 knives, 4 spoons, and wouldn't it be strange if Amazon posted them to you one by one? So tomorrow you get 1 fork, and in a few days' time you get 1 spoon. Wouldn't it be better if they packaged them all up in a single box in a cutlery set and sent you your cutlery in one package, so one time? So we can relate this back to our previous discussion on collection variables and DML statements. Instead of posting 12 pieces of cutlery, which in Flow would be 12 DML statements, why don't we package them up in one cutlery set and post them once, one DML statement? I hope this has given you a little bit more clarity about some of those flow concepts and shown that we can learn them. We just need the right context to do so, the right examples. And so I would offer to you that it's really important to go and find whatever works for you in terms of studying and learning flow. Go and find a course, go and look on Trailhead, but definitely do that learning, do that research before you get started. So let's move on to our second tip of the session, and that's to improve your page performance using the Analyze button. Now, the Analyze button has been around for a while, but it has been enhanced over the last few releases. And what it does is it gives you your predicted page load times for desktop, also your page performance index for mobile and tablet, which is similar but not quite the same as page load times. In addition, it gives you best practices and suggestions for improvement. Now, the Analyze button should run automatically. If it doesn't, you can always hit Analyze at any point, as you can see in the screenshot here. So why is this important? Well, more clicks, too many clicks, too much time loading is really off-putting for our users. We are users when we use the internet, when we do our online shopping, when we use things like Amazon, when we use Salesforce ourselves. Nobody likes waiting for pages to load, and there are many ways that we can improve our page performance. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So first of all, page performance for the desktop. Now this is showing me a predicted page load time of 3.4 seconds. Now that's moderate, it's okay. It could definitely be better. But even better here, it's giving me a performance breakdown by component. And you can see a heavy hitter is the record detail. The record detail component is one of the slowest loading components on the page. And I would also say to you that this was done in a demo org with very little data and actually very few fields. So in reality, I expect you have a lot more fields than this page did, and your record detail page is probably going to load even slower. And there are many ways that we can adjust this. So for example, we can use tabs, we can use the accordion, and sometimes it's better to have your page load on your related list or related list quick actions instead of the record detail. Put the record detail in a different tab so that it loads much faster. You can see here, highlights panel doesn't take up too much. I had a report chart, which is also loading. Related list quick links load very quickly, so they can be a very good option to have there. So pay attention to that and have a play around with your pages to appreciate what's going to improve your page performance, but never never at the risk of upsetting your users. So if your users always need to be on the details component first, then although it might improve page load time to move it to a tab, that could actually negatively impact their working experience. So check these things before you make any changes. Next, we've got the page performance for the phone, and you can see our page performance index is 3.25, still in the moderate category, not great, creeping up towards the red section there, and page performance index is similar to page load time. And again, some great tips going on here. So too many components. On my page, I have 10 components, and the recommended maximum for the mobile is 8. So you should consider using the Lightning App Builder to conditionally show components on your mobile, or have a separate page layout for the phone form factor. And you can also see here that the related record that I have on the page is a high impact component. So perhaps I don't want to use that on my mobile layout. Perhaps I should use related list quick links instead. And finally, the tablet. So the tablet again has the page performance index, and we're still in the moderate category, so I could definitely do some improvements here. But notice that I have a high impact component on the tablet that differs from the mobile, and that is the highlights panel. So it's worth exploring what you need to do for tablet, phone, and desktop. So our third tip today is going to be to learn about restriction rules. And I hope you have heard about restriction rules. They really shake up the traditional sharing model. So we end up with traditional sharing versus restriction rules. And the reason for this is restriction rules lock down records, whereas the traditional security model opens up access. So if you take a look at the shape on the page, you can see that we are opening up access. So we start with our most restrictive use case in our org-wide defaults, and we open it up through the role hierarchy, through sharing rules, and through manual sharing. Well, restriction rule acts in the opposite way. It locks down records. Now, this is great because it gives you more control in a master-detail relationship. And if you think about a master detail, the child record is always controlled by the parent. So if you have access to the parent record, by default, you have access to the child records as well. And that's not always what we want to do. Restriction rules are going to allow you to selectively share child records. And here's a really good example of when you might want to do something like this. Let's say that we are using accounts and we have account teams. So we have multiple sales users with access to an account. And by default, they all have access to each other's activities like tasks. Now, perhaps you don't want them to be able to see each other's tasks. This is where something like restriction rules would come in, because it would allow you to selectively share task records, even if someone has access to the parent account. It's worth noting that it's only available currently for custom objects, external objects, and some standard objects, including contracts, events, and tasks. Our tip number 4 is to supercharge productivity with Einstein Search. Now, I bring this one up because initially I don't think it got a lot of love and it needed to be enabled, but now it's on by default from winter 22. It is Lightning only, so if you're still looking for an excuse to move over to Lightning, this is a great reason to do so. And I love this quote from Salesforce about using Einstein Search. So they say that using Einstein Search can result in an up to 50% reduction in clicks and page loads for the most frequently used tasks, such as editing sales records. And as we've already talked about, extra clicks and slow page loading is really off-putting to users. So anything that enhances the user experience is a great feature to roll out and make sure you're getting the greatest return on investment for Salesforce. So how does it work? Well, here is a screenshot. Once you start typing in the search bar, and this is the same global search bar that we've been using for forever, you get tips. So you can see on the shot here, it's giving you prompts as to what they can do with Einstein Search. Number 2 is suggested searches. Number 3, recent items. And 4, suggested list views that they might like to use. So very, very helpful. Next, we've got actionable results. And what does this mean? Well, let's say I start searching for a contact in the global search bar. In the example on the screen today, it says Alexa. Now, it's given me results, Alexa Lightning, she's a lead, and I can hover over Alexa Lightning, and then I can see details about her. I can see her title, I can see her company, but I can also see buttons. I can see the option to convert and the option to edit. Actionable results. Instead of having to click into that record and then click on a button, I can do it straight from search. And then finally, Einstein has natural language search. So these are things like my open opportunities, cases closed last week. And I've got another example for you on the screen here. I've searched for my leads in Bristol, and Einstein Search is able to identify that I'm looking for leads. And it's also identified that it should search for the city of Bristol in the address. So it's super, super powerful, but I think a feature that users may not realize are there unless you tell them so. Now, finally, my fifth tip, which is actually broken down into several features, is to upskill users on new report and dashboard features, because it's all good and well us knowing about them as admins, but we also need to relay them to our users and empower them to get the most out of Salesforce. So first of all, find the right report type, which was beta in spring 22. So when you create a new report, you'll be able to see recently used reports, who created the report and when, which objects are used in the report, and also fields that are in the report as well, so they can select the right report type first time. Next, inline editing reports, which has been enhanced multiple times over the past year. This means that you can update a record or records directly from a report. No need to navigate to a record and then rerun the reports. There are specific fields that you can update, so text, number, checkbox, date, pick list, and lookup fields. If in any doubt, if it has a pencil icon next to it, you can update it. If it has a little lock icon next to it, you can't update it. Dynamic gauge charts have been a hugely requested feature for a long time. Now they must be enabled, but once they are, they can compare a report metric with a numeric field on a record. These are great for things like sales team targets or individual sales team member targets. And what it means is that you can set a gauge to be dynamic to track different people's targets. When your dashboard is filtered based on a specific user, the dynamic gauge will adjust to their targets instead of showing the entire team's targets. Summary functions now include median. That was introduced in summer 22, and for anyone who's not aware, that's the middle or midpoint, but I think this feature will go down very nicely with any finance users, so make sure that they know about it. And then finally, you can now limit results in tabular reports as of summer 22. And I know this was a feature in Classic, but it hasn't been a feature in Lightning until now, and we are so pleased to see it back. So this means that you can limit your results of a report to, say, the first 50 rows. Once you've added a limit, you can then add charts and also add it into a dashboard. But I felt like this feature was a little bit hidden, and if it was hard for me to find, I strongly suspect it will be hard for your users to find, so you might want to give them a little training session or send out a little memo about where to find it. So if you go onto the filters tab, as you can see in the screenshot, there's a drop down. You get the option of adding a row limit, but before you do any of that, you need to sort by a column first. So there is a specific way of going about doing this, and it's worth learning it and then passing that knowledge on to your users. So that's all the tips from me today. I really hope you enjoyed my top 5 tips that every admin needs in 2022. I think I should have changed the title to 5 tips every admin needs in 2022 and beyond, as these are all features that are constantly being enhanced and are going to make up a huge part of your admin future. I would love to connect with you. I've put some QR codes here on the screen, so please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and I've also put a link to the Salesforce Ben blog as well. Don't forget that we have tons and tons of free content for you, covering all of the features that I've talked about today, but in particular our flow content. We have a lot of free flow content for you there. Thank you so much for joining my sessions, and thank you as well to the sponsors and also to the organisers of this fantastic event.